Hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. I'm here today to talk about one of the unlikeliest stories in all world history, and that is the rise of Christianity, its rise from a very marginalized status to the status of imperial religion. This is a major turning point in this course in Humanities 101, and indeed in the entire four-semester humanities program, because from this point on, Christianity is going to be one of the major driving forces of Western history. And this is true all the way to the 20th century, as you'll see in Humanities 202. So no matter who you are today, Christianity is something that affects your life and affects your culture. And of course, if you are a believer, I know many of you are, then this is a story that's going to have additional interest and import. So, as I've already said, this story of how Christianity manages not only to survive persecution, but to become the dominant religion of the world today is quite a stunning one. It is a story that no one in the first century could have really predicted. I think many of us who are Christians have this sense that there was just something kind of inevitable about it, that of course Christianity is going to become this dominant religion because it's wonderful and Jesus is great and all of that. And of course, if you're a Christian, you believe that. But from a historical point of view, there is absolutely nothing inevitable about the rise of Christianity. You have to imagine if, someone today came to you and said, hey, in 300 years, Scientology is going to be the dominant religion of the USA. And if you want to run for president, you've got to at least pretend to be a Scientologist or something like that. That would sound utterly ridiculous to us. And that's how it would have sounded to the ears of a first century Roman if you told them, hey, in just 300 years, all the emperors are going to be Christian and virtually all Romans are going to be Christian as well. Um, we have to keep in mind that Christianity begins not only as a kind of tiny sect, but one that was regarded with great contempt by the vast majority of Romans. Romans didn't really care very much for the Jews. They sort of tolerated them, but Christians seemed like sort of quasi-Jews, but worse somehow, even more antisocial, even less patriotic than the Jews. So it's an unlikely story, and as I said, it's a story that absolutely affects at the most profound level our culture today. Christianity catches on in a big way in the Roman Empire relatively late in the history of the empire. And so if Christianity had been just a little slower to achieve its sort of dominant status, then the Middle Ages as we know them would look entirely different. They probably look a lot more like the Game of Thrones than the actual Middle Ages that we know and that we'll study in this class. So I'm trying to tell a very complicated story today in a very short amount of time. I just want to start by making one point, which is that we can't say that Christianity became the predominant religion in the Roman Empire because there wasn't much competition, because it was really like the only game in town. In fact, we know that that's not the case. So let me get my PowerPoint open. This is I believe, a 3rd century ring with a Christian symbol on it. You can see there's an anchor there in the center, and that was a kind of symbol of Christ, and then 2 fish on either side. Okay. So what were the competitors to early Christianity? Well, first and foremost, traditional Greco-Roman pagan religion, polytheistic religion. Okay, so this is the worship of the gods like Jupiter and Juno and Minerva and so on. And, people wouldn't choose to participate in this kind of religion. This was just something that you engaged in as part of your civic duty. It was just expected. It really wasn't anything to think about. Religion in the ancient world was not really considered a matter of private choice. Rather, religion was a public matter because the primary function of religion was to support and protect the political community. So a very different way of sort of thinking about religion. And, in the imperial period, which is when Christianity first comes to birth, the emperors were considered sort of the high priests of religion, of traditional Greco-Roman religion. And so when you participate in those religious rites and festivals, it's a way of showing your patriotism. And speaking of the emperors, starting with Augustus and going all the way till, well, for centuries, emperor worship itself became an important part of Greco-Roman pagan religion. Third, this is something we've already talked about, although you'll read a little bit more about this in a few days. Mystery religions were quite popular. Now, these were purely voluntary. The only people who were engaged in mystery religions, like the cult of Isis or the cult of Mithras, these were people who were sort of religious seekers who chose to supplement Greco-Roman polytheism with a special devotion to a particular god. And again, I'll remind you that these cults were known as mystery religions because of the secretive nature of their initiation rites. And finally, we would be remiss without mentioning Judaism, the mother religion of Christianity. Christianity, of course, begins not on day one as a totally independent, autonomous religion, but as one particular form of Judaism. And it takes some time before Christianity really is able to achieve a kind of independent status. I do want to point out that even though Judaism is largely a kind of ethnic religion, in other words, it's a religion that for the most part you would inherit because of who your parents were, there were a number of Gentiles, non-Jews in the Roman period who were very attracted to Judaism, attracted to its monotheism, attracted to its strong sense of morality. Some of these Gentiles actually fully converted and became full-fledged Jews, but there were others who were perhaps not quite ready to go all the way. Of course, if you were a male, there were good reasons why you might not want to go all the way, but who nonetheless, attended services at synagogues and tried to live according to the law as best they could. These people were known as God-fearers. And this group of God-fearers, Cornelius in the Bible is one example, shows us that Judaism itself had some real appeal even for non-Jews. Now, of course, from Dr. Jackson's lecture that something terribly traumatic happens to the Jewish people in the year 70. The temple was destroyed. But that was not the end of Judaism, but rather it was brought about the reinvention of Judaism. So Judaism is going to adapt and reinvent itself. So again, the point of all of this is that Christianity does not triumph by dint of lack of competition. There were plenty of other options for people in the early Roman world. Okay, so now we're going to begin our chronological story here, talking about the relations between the church and the Roman state in the first 2 centuries of the Common Era. Again, I'll emphasize that Christianity began as a movement within, not outside of Judaism. Now, Judaism was tolerated by the Romans. The Romans did not have any special love for Judaism, but the Romans were willing to tolerate it. And so Jews were not required to worship the emperor, for instance. But as the church began to assert a kind of independent identity over against Judaism, the Roman state did not extend the same privileges of toleration to the Christians as it did to the Jewish people. But it's going to take some time before the Romans actually begin persecuting Christians in earnest. It's going to take several decades. It's not until the year 64 CE that we have the first instance of the Roman government, of a Roman emperor, instigating a persecution against Christians. The emperor is Nero, and the catalyst was this great fire in the city of Rome. Nero was so bonkers by this time that a number of Romans believed that Nero himself was behind the fire. Now, historians today are quite sure that wasn't the case, but at the time he was strongly suspected, and Nero needed a scapegoat. He needed to take the heat off of himself, as it were, and find another group to blame. And the Christians turned out to be a convenient scapegoat. Again, a lot of people probably didn't even know very much about the Christians, or maybe had even heard of Christianity at this point. But those who knew anything about them, Romans who knew anything about them, tended to think of them as an antisocial and a highly suspect kind of group. So Nero rounds up a bunch of Christians. Some he dresses up in animal skins and has attacked by dogs. Others are crucified in Nero's own garden as Nero drives around in his chariot to make sure that his audience is having quite a nice time. So this was a traumatic event for the early Christians, and that trauma is probably reflected in the book of Revelation. But one key point to note here is that this is not the beginning of a persistent, systematic, broad-based Roman persecution of Christianity. And indeed, for the first several hundred years of church history, there really is not systematic persecution on the part of the Romans. Rather, you have these sort of flare-ups in some places, but not in others, at some times, but not at other times. And even after Nero's persecution, there was just not a clear sense among Roman leaders what they were supposed to be doing about Christians exactly. There was no clear protocol for them to follow. So this brings us to a couple of letters that were written about 50 years later, in the year 110. We have a letter written by a Roman governor named Pliny the Younger. He was a governor in Asia Minor. And he wrote a letter to Trajan, and Trajan wrote back. Trajan was the emperor. Basically, Pliny wasn't entirely sure what he was supposed to do with accused Christians, especially what he was supposed to do with anonymous accusations that so-and-so was a Christian. So he writes to Trajan, and it's clear that he sees Christians as basically harmless. He knows that some of the wilder rumors about them are not true. They're not really cannibals. They don't really get together and have wild orgies, and all these things were said of early Christians. So they're basically harmless. They're basically kind of like Boy Scouts, but he does not want their superstition, and he uses that word, and that's a Latin word, superstitio. He doesn't want their superstition to catch on and debase the minds of the Romans. So he writes to Trajan and says, look, what am I supposed to do with these people? And Trajan responds, a very short letter, but he basically lays out the way he wants Trajan and he wants Pliny and other governors to respond. First, do not seek out Christians. Okay? Don't go looking for them. That is a waste of imperial time and resources. If you get an anonymous accusation that a person is Christian, ignore it. The person is not willing to put their name on the accusation, it's probably frivolous. If you do get a legitimate accusation and you bring an accused Christian forward, give them a chance to recant. Give them a chance, multiple chances even, to renounce their faith, to curse the name of Christ, to make an offering of incense in honor of the emperor. Okay? And if they can do those things, then let them go. Because for Trajan, the goal is not to kill a bunch of people. The goal is just to stamp out Christians through other means. But it is clear that if the accused Christian is not willing to recant, is not willing to renounce his or her faith, then they will have to be made an example of and can lose their life. So that is the policy. That more or less is the official Roman policy for a number of decades to come. And for the remainder of the 2nd century, there are a number of persecutions. There are a number of Christians who die, sometimes horrible deaths. But again, the persecutions are sporadic. You know, if you're a Christian in the 2nd century, you may never experience persecution. On the other hand, there is a chance that you might have to die for your faith. So Christians, for the most part, were left alone, but they lived under a rather dark cloud during this time. Basically, I mean, the thing to keep in mind is that there just aren't that many Christians at this point. And so the Roman government, you know, they have bigger fish to fry, so to speak, and they're just not going to get too exercised about Christians. What that does mean is that the church is growing steadily in numbers. It is expanding geographically. In a very modest way, but in a steady and consistent way. And that exponential growth is really going to explode a little bit later on, as we'll see in just a moment. Okay, I wanted to share with you this map just to give you a sense of where Christians could be found towards the end of the 2nd century. And you see that thick orange line there. So basically, anything sort of inside those lines are places where Christians could be found. Now, in some of those places, Christians were much more concentrated than in others. And I think it is worth knowing that Christianity is very much predominantly an urban religion at this point. It is a religion of city dwellers in cities. So it's going to be particularly prevalent in places like the western coast of Asia Minor, which was quite urbanized. But you can see that it's growing mainly in a kind of westward direction at this point, all the way as far west as Spain in Europe, and in what now would be like Morocco and Tunisia in Africa. So notice it's spanning 3 continents. And at this point, it is really 99.9% contained within the boundaries of the Roman Empire. It's going to take more time before Christianity spills out beyond those boundaries. How many Christians were there around the year 200? Of course, it's impossible to say with anything approaching precision. But again, it's a small number. I mean, Christians probably make up less than 1% of the total population of the Roman Empire. Okay, so it's a pretty marginal phenomenon at this point. Well, now we move into the 3rd century, which, as you can see here, is going to be a century of very high highs and low lows for the Christians. First half of the century, relatively quiet. There is some persecution, but it never really lasts that long. And again, it's localized here, not there, that sort of thing. The middle decade of the 3rd century is a pretty tough one on Christians, because a guy named Decius becomes emperor, 249. You'll be reading more about this time period next week. This is a very difficult, trying period of Roman history. I mean, it really looks as if the Roman Empire is just going to collapse altogether. So Decius inherits this crisis and becomes convinced that the way to get Rome back on track, the way to make Rome great again, is by returning to old school, traditional pagan religion, and to really make have a kind of religious revival. And so Decius is going to do something that no previous Roman emperor had done, which is to legally mandate that everyone worship the Roman gods. And not only was everyone legally required to do this, you had to actually procure a certificate, a notarized certificate that certified that you participated in that pagan rite, that you participated in that sacrifice. And if you didn't comply, then it's not going to work out well for you. You could die, you could be enslaved. I mean, there's a whole number of really unappealing alternatives there. Now, certainly Decius was trying to snuff out Christianity, but not so much by making a bunch of martyrs, but rather by encouraging or coercing Christians to apostatize, that is to say, to renounce their faith. And actually, he had a fair amount of success in that. Now, fortunately for Christians, Decius is only going to reign for a couple of years. There is another emperor that comes soon after him that revives the persecution, but then that ends about 260. And then we enter this period of about 40 years, 260 to 300, where the Roman government just leaves Christians alone. Christianity doesn't receive legal recognition, but most Christians became convinced that it was only a matter of time before Rome would do that. So Christians are sort of left alone, and their exponential growth really begins to accelerate in rather dramatic ways. So, for instance, scholars think that Christians go from making up about 2% of the population of the empire in 250 to 10% in 300. Or to put that in hard numbers, there may have been about 1 million Christians in 250, and then about 6 million by 300. That is explosive growth. So Christians are just going along thinking that the days of persecution are in the past. Unfortunately for them, they are not. There is going to be one other round of persecution, and it's going to be the most harrowing persecution that Christians have faced up to that point. This is the persecution unleashed by Diocletian. who's actually emperor for a long time before ever raising a finger against Christians, but he eventually is convinced that, again, the only way to revive the fortunes of the Roman Empire is to revive religion. And the Christians are the main obstacle to that revival. So we get, starting in 303, what scholars today call the Great Persecution of Diocletian, which starts in 303 and lasts, at least in some places, as late as 312. So it's long lasting. New tactics are used that had not been used before. The Romans destroyed church buildings. They went around and gathered books, Bibles, sacred objects, and had those destroyed. They threw priests and deacons into prison. Eventually, Diocletian basically throws down the same gauntlet as Decius and says, all right, everybody has to make a sacrifice to the gods, or else be killed or be enslaved and work in the imperial mines or something like that. So this is a really, really difficult period for Christians, although in some places, even still, especially in the West, Christians are not nearly as violently persecuted as they are in places like Egypt or Palestine. This is going to not only obviously cause a great deal of grief and discouragement, but as you'll hear in Dr. Farmer's lecture, this persecution is going to cause permanent divides within the church. The church is actually going to split, in a sense, over this, because there's going to be huge arguments after the persecution is over as to what you do with those people who gave in during the persecution, who participated in pagan rituals, who made the sacrifice, who handed over Bibles to be burned, and then want to be readmitted into the church. What do you do with those people? And there's going to be a wide spectrum of responses to that. So be listening for that in Dr. Farmer's lecture. All right, well, that brings us to Constantine, who, at least in terms of church history, is the most significant Roman emperor ever. Constantine does a number of things that really will change the course of world history. For one thing, in the year 313, he and one of his co-emperors issued the so-called Edict of Milan, which legalizes Christianity for the very first time. This is really the first full legal recognition of the legitimacy of Christianity. So that's a big deal. Now, it's a blanket kind of affirmation of religious freedom. So it is not an edict mandating that all Romans become Christians. And we're going to get there, but later on with another emperor. The other thing to know about Constantine is that at the end of his life in 337, even though he had certainly been deeply drawn to Christianity for decades, he had never actually gone through with baptism. And when he's on his deathbed, he is in fact baptized. So this is something else we can say about Constantine, another first. Constantine was the first Christian Roman emperor. And after Constantine, every Roman emperor except one will be a Christian. And that one didn't even rule for 2 full years. So Constantine is the future in many ways for the Roman Empire. All right, so this brings us to our very last, I promise, emperor, Theodosius I, who reigns toward the end of the 4th century. And The church and empire were already quite cozy by the time that Theodosius became emperor. But Theodosius takes things to the next level in the year 380. He takes a step that even Constantine never took. He declared Christianity as the official religion of the Roman Empire. Now, does that mean he was going around forcing pagans or Jews to become Christians? No, he was not. But he was taking real concrete steps to make it difficult to be a pagan in the late 4th century. So he's going to pass laws prohibiting sacrifices, both public and private pagan sacrifices. And sacrifice, as you all know, is very much at the heart of pagan religion, of Greco-Roman polytheism. So from this time on, there are still a few pagans knocking about in the Roman Empire, but their days are numbered. Paganism is a dying religion at this point. So Christianity is not the only game in town, even as late as the late 4th century, but it has become demographically the predominant religion of the Roman Empire, and it has become officially the imperial religion. And this, of course, paves the way for the Middle Ages, which we'll be studying next unit, and helps us to understand why in the Middle Ages, in Western Europe anyway, and in places like Asia Minor, virtually everyone is going to be a Christian, at least in name. How is that possible? It's possible because of these dramatic events of the 4th century. All right, thanks for spending a little time with me.